Hello and welcome to today's meeting for Saturday, February 5th. You may have been awakened today with this fake news headline from Bloomberg. Actually, New York Post reported it. Bloomberg accidentally reports that Russia invades Ukraine. This was up on the Bloomberg site for approximately 30 minutes. How did it stay up for 30 minutes without correction? Vladimir Putin was at that time in Beijing at the Olympic ceremony and out of the country. Was there no American intelligence agency among the 17 that was able to contact Bloomberg to correct this? This is a state of alert, or should be, for all of us, and certainly for the national security apparatus. We've been spending weeks now talking about a pending invasion of Russia, by Russia of Ukraine. A congressional investigation needs to occur into this to see how this occurred, because it could not have been an accident. The atomic scientist doomsday clock, which often has the sort of forecast concerning nuclear war or general war, has been at 100 seconds, or just over a minute and a half, to midnight for the second year in a row. War with Russia using Ukraine as the pretext, or war with China using Taiwan as a pretext, would only bring ruin to the United States and the world, and could in fact very possibly end civilization as a whole. There was a time that there was American leadership that spoke out not only vigorously against this, but actually proposed alternatives. What we'd like to do is to go to two examples of that, one being John F. Kennedy, Georgetown, June 1963, and the other, Lyndon LaRouche, May 4th, 2001, in order to introduce our topic, the science of strategy. Durable survival lies in the complex domain.
I have therefore chosen this time and place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth too rarely perceived, and that is the most important topic on earth: peace. What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time. I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary, rational end of rational men. I realize the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuers fall on deaf ears, but we have no more urgent task. First, examine our attitude towards peace itself. Too many of us think it is impossible. Too many think it is unreal. But that is a dangerous, defeatist belief. It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. We need not accept that view. Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man, and man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again. So let us persevere. Peace need not be impractical, and war need not be inevitable. By defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly towards it. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. As Americans, we find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and dignity. But we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, in acts of courage. Among the many traits the peoples of our two countries have in common, none is stronger than our mutual abhorrence of war. Almost unique among the major world powers, we have never been at war with each other, and no nation in the history of battle ever suffered more than the Soviet Union in the Second World War. At least 20 million lost their lives. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal.
Now, the peculiar part of this is the case of Russia. Russia has gone from communism to liberalism without passing go, and certainly without getting $20 or $200. It got nothing. As a matter of fact, it lost money on the deal, as anyone knows. So Russia, the problem in Russia is to define itself, again, intention. This will work if Russia adopts the intention of playing that role for itself in a Eurasian development program, which means leading people in Russia must adopt such a perspective. And the Russian people must increasingly participate in that vision of the role of Russia in changing the situation in Eurasia and in Russia itself. Under those conditions, therefore, the role of Russia as a pivot with other parts of Eurasia is crucial. How? Well, first of all, there are conflicts of a historical and cultural nature among most of the nations of Asia. China and India, for example. China and Japan. Korea with China and Japan. And so forth and so on. So that on a bilateral basis, long-term agreements among these nations are very difficult to manage. However, if you have a common mission with a common interest, which involves a great number of these nations together, then you can bring them together in the system of cooperation. This is the natural role in which Russia can play a mediating part throughout Eurasia. What came up with Primakov when Primakov was prime minister on the triangular cooperation which we boosted very much and pushed for among Russia, China, and India to bring the nations of Asia together in this form. That is a viable idea. It has to be given more legs to walk on and a mind to direct it in that sense. But now in Western Europe, which is potentially a place we can revive the kind of high technology export potential which once existed in Germany, Italy, and so forth. Western Europe has to adopt a mission. Central Europe has to adopt a mission of participating in this development of Eurasia as a group of sovereign nation states through instrumentalities which they create among themselves to facilitate this cooperation. The object would be to bring the United States in to cooperate with that great venture. And when you look at Africa, as you'll have some discussion of that here, Africa has no chance. It's been too looted unless it has help. The help it requires is of the same nature. The primary needs from the outside for Africa, the crucial needs are in the area of basic economic infrastructure, particularly large-scale, extensible systems of large-scale basic economic infrastructure. Transportation links, power grids, water management. The redistribution of water in Africa can make a revolutionary difference in Africa. They needs assistance on this. If Africa is allowed to have the room to undertake its own development with that kind of assistance, Africa can develop. This assistance must come from other viable other parts of the world. Prime case, Eurasia. If Eurasia is developing prosperously, then Eurasia will help Africa. But if the Americas and Eurasia are not developing, there will be no help for Africa. And the penalty of what has been done to Africa, like an infectious disease, will continue to destroy Africa, internally and otherwise. And therefore, we should see this connection in the world. Eurasia is the great center of human population. On it, there's a frontier. The conquest of inner space of Eurasia is a great focal point for a mission out of this process. When we then turn from Eurasia development to look to Africa and see the misery there, then we see a larger mission which exemplifies humanity as a whole. That's our chance.
This was American leadership with vision, which thought of the progress and development of other nations as part of its own national interest, and which thought beyond the silly imperial idea of geopolitics, the geopolitics of people like Halford Mackinder. What happened to us? How did we shrink? Why does today's United States, which, advised by British intelligence, conducted the illegal Iraq War in 2003 on the false pretext of finding weapons of mass destruction, killing over 1 million people in total in that nation? Why does the United States, which now silently ensures the starvation of 1 million plus children in Afghanistan by preventing billions of dollars belonging to that government from being released to it? Why does today's United States preach to China or any other nation in the world about human rights violations? How can today's United States, which participated in the destruction by war of Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Afghanistan, as well as the February 2014 overthrow of the elected government of Ukraine, seriously represent these actions as the spreading of democracy to the planet? In his essay of March 2002, 20 years ago, How Democracy Became Diseased, Lyndon LaRouche said, during the recent quarter century, the official meaning of the word democracy in the United States had been shifted radically away from what it had signified during the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt. That change occurred in the form of a shift away from sundry earlier loose rule of thumb understandings toward a thoroughly nasty, narrow-minded coincidence with the pro-fascist dogmas of Bertrand Russell's accomplice, Herbert George Wells. I emphasize the indisputably fascist intentions summed up by Wells himself in his 1928 The Open Conspiracy. Madeleine Albright is one of the major proponents of this idea of democracy and Project Democracy, and many of her epigonies, whether you're talking about Condoleezza Rice, Susan Rice, Samantha Power, or others, Hillary Clinton for that matter, mimic the same thing. And Samuel Huntington's book, The Soldier and the State, outlines the American military imperial policy, which is not a policy of the liberation of anyone, but is in fact a way of sort of trying to extend this bankrupt idea of geopolitics. What we're going to do in today's discussion is to take up, by means of giving you both a briefing on what's been going on, the so-called current history, and then the background, the larger, if you will, epistemological matters, try to get at how this change happened and how the change can be reversed. And we want to take up particularly the cases of China and Russia, but from a certain standpoint. And so to start us off today, I want to take Bill Jones first from our Asia desk of EIR. Bill, I see I understand you're on your way to a certain ceremony, and I don't want to take away your time, so go take it away. You may want people to know, or maybe you don't want them to know, but it's too late now. So go right ahead.
Okay, hello everybody, and happy Chinese New Year to everyone. This is the year of the tiger, and the tiger represents courage and boldness. And they say that people who are born in the year of the tiger like to take on challenges. And I think all of us should consider ourselves born in the year of the tiger because we like to take on challenges, and the challenge ahead of us is a big one. I am going off to a spring festival event, the only one I've had this season, where there'll be some dumplings and the like, which are also part of the celebrations of the Chinese New Year. So I won't be here with you during the question period. I'm sure the other speakers will be able to effectively take your questions. And if you have anything specific for me, you're welcome to email me or to contact the organizers and let me know what you have on your mind. I don't know if any of y'all have seen or saw the last night the opening ceremony of the Beijing Olympics. The Winter Olympics now are in Beijing. Beijing hosted 2008 the Spring Olympics. Now they're doing the Winter Olympics, and they're the only city that has done both of these Olympics. It was a major political event. Now, the Olympics are not supposed to be a political event, but they happen to be so because of a certain number of things that have been going on. The Olympics were mentioned by Friedrich Schiller in his aesthetic letters, letters on the aesthetic education of man, in which he talked not about the Olympics as we know them, but as they were in Greece. And of course, he had a great respect for Greece as the source of great culture in the West. That's where we got it from, came largely through Egypt, from the Middle East. But Greece was really the central point for the development of Western culture. And Greeks also had the Olympics. And it was a contest, as today, between individuals from different cities and different places to try and excel, to try and break records, to try and go as far as they could in testing their abilities. And it was always done under friendly circumstance. It was a competition, but it was a competition people together to meet the goals, to try and break the records that have already been set. Schiller contrasted this to the Roman culture, which was centered around the gladiators, in which the gladiators each other to the death, or fought lions that usually won the game, or something like that. These were the two cultures that he depicted as the differences between a humanist vision and a bestial vision. And if you look at the world today, and you look at, and I advise people to look at this opening ceremony, which I'm sure will be on YouTube, you'll see the beauty of the occasion. It has become a political event because the United States, in its attempt to limit China, decided to have a boycott and attempted to get all the other nations, their so-called Western allies, anybody else who would come on board, to also boycott the Olympics. To some extent, they did succeed, but there were over 21 national leaders who did go to the Olympics. Only a few who made a formal boycott, but there were many countries that didn't go because who didn't send their leaders. The athletes all went, even the American athletes were there, but no official visits because of this so-called boycott. But 21 leaders did go and did meet there, and there are a series of meetings afterwards with President Xi Jinping on the issues that he has been raising recently. And what he's been saying, of course, if people have been following this all, is that to create a world order similar to what Mr. LaRouche was talking about in that lecture in Russia, to create the ability of countries like in Africa, in Latin America, to develop, to realize the program that had been the wish, the dream of Franklin Roosevelt, but had really stopped at the point that Roosevelt died, and has never really gotten to the point of taking off until this very day. China has taken up the challenge on this. China is now not only big, it's also economically strong. And what President Xi initiated in 2013 with this Belt and Road Initiative was a clear attempt to share that development to use the Chinese economic potential to build infrastructure, to build power plants in places like Africa, Latin America, and the other parts of Asia. And this has been resented by the United States simply because China is doing the proposing. The U.S., on the other hand, has found itself in a major economic bind, ignoring the policies that Mr. LaRouche was pushing in the 1970s, which would have changed the entire situation. And now they're learning the lessons of their failure to having listened to LaRouche. But there's a sense of anger and envy and an attempt to maintain what they believe is the United States' sole right to rule the world, to set the rules of the world. China has contested that. It has a different policy. It feels that the world has not been a world of equality, economically as well as politically. And therefore, they are doing what they can to try and get things moving in the developing sector and to realize some of the program that Mr. LaRouche was talking about could be done if Eurasia and if the United States work together to develop these countries in Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere. The United States, of course, has, as we look at the other end of Schiller's statement about the Roman culture and the fights in the gladiators, we see in Ukraine is exactly this: throwing in massive military material, getting prepared for war, putting soldiers on the border of the Baltic states or on the border of Russia, ready to move at a moment's notice. This is the culture that has now become dominant in the United States. So you have the contrast of the Beijing Olympics with what's going on in Ukraine gives an idea of what Schiller was talking about and the difference between these two cultures. Now, Beijing became an issue. The event was very important because everybody was conscious that what this was an attempt to do was to bring the world together in a very tense situation in which there is a lot of animosity, in which the drums of war are sounding everywhere, and trying to make of the Olympics what it always had been, that is, bringing countries together, diverse countries with different cultures, with different political systems, and even with a lot of divergences and animosities in this one particular site to try and bring the individuals who were the best in their country to try and achieve and to break the records that have previously been set. And that was all done in a friendly manner. This was the spirit of what went on last night. It was actually yesterday morning, but it wasn't shown until the evening here in the U.S. to get the biggest crowd. And the whole thing was oriented towards creating a peaceful resolution of all these problems, of bringing together the world in a peaceful program for economic development. President Xi opened the Olympics himself, but the major speech was given by the head of the IOC, the Olympic Committee, Thomas Bach, who took up the same kind of issues that President Xi introduced most recently in his Davos speech: the need for unity in the world, the need to overcome the contradictions, the need for development, the need for creating people who are capable of reaching the heights, of doing whatever they can to actually reach their goals and to use their powers as much as they can for the best of mankind. So with all these people, these world leaders gathered there, this was, I think, an important instance of a sense of power, of being able to move in the direction that Mr. LaRouche was talking about. The funny thing about the matter is that China, of course, and many of the countries that were there came together to talk with President Xi about the continued development of this economic programs. Ecuador was there, Egypt was there, many of the countries from the developing sector. And out of this will come not only this renewal of the Olympic spirit, but the renewal of the Olympic spirit in which can be implemented in the political arena. Russia and China were both there. President Putin and President Xi had their first meetings in person for a very long time. They've been in contact with each other almost constantly, but remotely. And they worked out a program of development and issued a joint statement, which backs up this notion that both of them are totally supportive of this idea that the world must move in a different direction. We must overcome these contradictions, these dangers of war, by taking consideration to the defense of all the countries, by taking consideration to the economic needs of all these countries. And a very important declaration just by these two nations, which of course are major powers, to back up the push in the direction of this global economic development. And people tend to think of it as a Chinese program or a Chinese-Russia political gambit. But as we saw also in the comments by Mr. LaRouche and the video by LaRouche, is it all started here. And it all started here 50 years ago in a very complicated situation here in the United States. In the early 70s, late 1960s, when Lyndon LaRouche first took upon himself the responsibility for trying to create an organization that could change the course of world history, the United States was in a mess. I mean, the whole world was in a mess. The United States was the middle of the Vietnam War. You had 54,000 Americans that were killed in Vietnam. The average age was 19. It was a very young army. People went to high school, got out of high school, and then they ended up in the jungles, and that's where they ended their lives. And it was a very chaotic situation in terms of the racial tension. 68, of course, the two of the major leaders for change in America, Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, were assassinated. The country was in a tither. Nobody knew where they were going. You had all kinds of crazy things going on. You had opposition to the Vietnam War, which was a good thing, and it was widespread. But there was a lot of insanity in the development of the drug culture and the escapism by the young people there. And it was not an easy situation, but the world was also in pretty bad shape. The Soviet Union was in good shape to some extent, but internally it was very bad economically. The Soviets had a very strong military power, but their economic situation for the ordinary individual was extremely bad. And Lyndon LaRouche was the first one to point that out and to try and give them an indication of how they could resolve that problem. China had just entered the Cultural Revolution, and this was total chaos. This was a madhouse. And here you have Lyndon LaRouche, a single individual, out of World War II, coming out of the FDR perspective, trying to create some kind of an organization that could change the direction that the world was moving in. And there were successes here. In 1973, he decided to create this. We talked about fusion energy. In 74, created the Fusion Energy Foundation as an organization to push for the development of thermonuclear fusion energy 50 years ago. And it was very successful. The Fusion Energy Foundation had issued a Fusion magazine. They had 36,000 subscribers, and they had probably about 90,000 readers, and because it was out on the newsstand. And as a result of that political support, in 1980, the U.S. Congress, with the direct cooperation and collaboration of people in the Fusion Energy Foundation, passed a fusion energy bill, which was signed into law by Jimmy Carter. Carter, at that point, lost the election, And a lot of the people who were pushing fusion in the U.S. Congress also lost their elections as well. So it was really left out on a limb to die an early death until it was renewed more recently by both in the United States and in other countries. But this was 50 years ago. This was a major success of the LaRouche organization. The other, of course, was the Strategic Defense Initiative that people know about, which Lyndon LaRouche was succeeded in getting President Reagan to accept what was indeed a peace policy with the Soviet Union by his agreement, by his willingness to share technologies with the Soviet Union, and to so that both sides would be able to defend against nuclear attack, reflecting what Kennedy had tried to do years earlier. Why was this not successful? It's because the political establishment, people call them the deep state, but it was really the British Empire. It's been the British Empire since the Round Table developed in Britain the beginning of the 20th century to try and work out ways of taking over ideologically and philosophically the United States political establishment. And they came down on LaRouche with a ton of bricks. And we know the results of that. But the message had been heard far and wide, and it reverberated in many places. Of course, in Russia, where he was a guest numerous times, also speaking at the Duma at the highest level, and there was a response there. And from Russia, it also reverberated into China. And the first real context that we had with the Chinese came through some of the people on the Russian side who were working in the institute dealing with China. There were sinologues who knew very well what was going on there and felt that there was also there a response to LaRouche, would be a response to LaRouche's ideas. But the Chinese had already been listening to Lin at a very early stage, and particularly around the period of the Strategic Defense Initiative, which came as something of a shock to the Chinese for a variety of reasons. One is because they had been at odds with the United States, and they were then at odds with the Soviet Union. And here the Soviets and the U.S. were getting together to create this major program of beam defense, which would have tremendous scientific consequences for those two countries. And the question for them was, where do we stand in this, and what do we do? So there was a mobilization on trying to, get on the stick so that any major scientific breakthroughs that occurred would not leave them behind. And every press conference that we had during those days, I know in Europe, there were Chinese people who came to listen, not to speak, not to ask questions, but to listen and to report back what was happening. There was also the fact that the Chinese Chinese scholars came to the United States at a certain point to study the LaRouche-Riemann economic model. So that things were churning already there at that early date. But the real threshold moment was, of course, when we succeeded, when Helge and Lin had introduced the productive triangle and the extension of the productive triangle into Central Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union. This also caught on, and in our contacts with the Chinese and with the Russians, we set up this major conference in 1996 on the subject of the new Silk Road, the Eurasian land bridge. And from there, of course, Helge, of course, was a major speaker in this, and that had its also reverberation. It didn't take off in the same way immediately, because we had, after that, a number of major economic crises. The 1997-98 crisis with the ruble and the Asian crisis, and then in 2008, the major financial crisis. So that there was a lot on the plate of the Chinese during that period. But after that was overcome in 2013, then President Xi introduced his Belt and Road Initiative. In this respect, in many respects, this would not have happened had it not been for our activity. It's not that they simply, I mean, there are many, China went through a very convoluted economic period from the Cultural Revolution until the present day, a lot of experimentation and a lot of experimentation that did not lead to success. But ultimately, they got the message, and they took that message and put that on their bannerhead, to try and lead the world into a new world economic order. And this has been the consistent policy of President Xi, who is a very unique individual in his own right. And if you read any of his writings, and they're published extensively, when he was a young, 20, 30-year-old working in a small village, everything was oriented towards trying to improve the conditions of the people for which he was responsible. That's what he has done as the head of the Communist Party in China for the Chinese people. And that is what he is actually presenting for the world in trying to create the type of economic infrastructure and development in which every individual in this world can have the material needs they require for developing into productive human beings. And that's, from his own standpoint, that is his political philosophy. And I think that's what he will do until the day he dies. He has been singled out, of course, by this British establishment because of the fears that this means that China and possible Chinese solutions would have a place in the world arena. And why shouldn't they? Look, China, 1.5 billion, almost going on 1.5 billion people, I guess, would have something to say. They are now a motor, an engine of economic development. And there is no animosity against any country, and especially not against the United States. And they have been very specific about this. President Xi has also really bent over backwards to try and create relations, good relations with the United States. We remember what he tried to do when President Trump was there, also meeting when he was vice president when he was president with Vice President Biden, who came to visit. So that the onus of this situation lies here in the United States. We need to do certain things. We need to do certain things that could have started in the 1970s had Joe Biden, who was in a room with Lyndon LaRouche, had the guts to speak with Lynn. He refused. And as a result, he wasn't able to do anything to change that situation that now he's crying about, having infrastructure and rebuilding the U.S. economy. That could have been done a long time ago, even if Joe Biden had just lent his ear for a few minutes to Lyndon LaRouche, who happened to be in the same place at that time. So this is what our job is at this moment, is that we have got to bring the United States into the fold of this development policy. China has the Belt and Road Initiative, and this is, of course, being poo-pooed by the poobahs of the American establishment as a Chinese gambit. The Chinese are also aware of that. So that what President Xi had done, he said, okay, we'll do a global development initiative, and we'll have it at the UN, and everybody can be a part of it. And if the United States gets this Build Back Better, world off the ground at any rate, they could be a part of that too. We could work together on these issues. But in order to do that, the United States has got to see China as a, if not a friend, at least a partner, and to understand that they have no evil wishes against them. They don't want to call the shots in the world. They just want to have a say in the direction the world's going. You have to be treating them not as peons or not as vassal states. This is not an empire any longer. They have to be treated as equals. This foolish attempt to try and recreate the so-called alliance of democracies, of the so-called Western democracies, is not going to work. You're not going to put Humpty Dumpty together again. All of these democracies are in terrible situation. The populations are in an uproar. They're angry. They're split here in the United States in particular. So in one sense, because the political parties don't get it, we have got to create what you might call a third force from the rational people here to try and create the kind of institution that can have its effect on both parties, but mainly through individuals who haven't fallen for these false solutions that are being put out either on the Democratic side or the Republican side. We know that there's a tremendous amount of ferment going on. There's a tremendous amount of discontent. There's a tremendous amount of anger. But that was the case in the 1960s when Lyndon LaRouche began his lecturing at a number of universities on the East Coast. If we could have done it then, if it could be done then, it can be done now. And in many respects, it's going to be easier because then we didn't have a global development initiative. The only global development initiative that was put out there was by Fred Wills at the United Nations with our pamphlet on the International Development Bank, and it was also crushed by the British Empire. Today is different. Today now, most of the world has adhered to the vision that President Xi has been presenting. The United Nations now, the head of the United Nations, Secretary General Guterres, was in Beijing at the Olympics. So there's now a force of a different category than what we had in the 1970s. So if we can do the same kind of thing that Lynn did, with us in those days, and begin to recruit people to a rational solution of these problems, then we can win the game. And I think if we adopt the year of the tiger as our birth year and are willing to take up these big challenges, I think we can succeed.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Bill. Bill Jones is the Washington Bureau Chief of the EIR. He's going to be leaving soon, but we will forward any questions that you have for him. And if you just joined us, welcome. Our topic today is the science of strategy. Durable survival lies in the complex domain. Now, at the top of the hour, we talked about referenced a quote by Lyndon LaRouche from an article called How Democracy Became Diseased, in which he talked about the change in the definition of the conception of democracy in the United States after Roosevelt. And at one point, he says in that article that the change occurred in the form of a shift away from an earlier view and to one that coincided with what he characterized as the, quote, pro-fascist dogma of Bertrand Russell's accomplice, Herbert George Wells, H.G. Wells. And then referenced, as he put it, the 1928 Open Conspiracy by H.G. Wells. This is a writing of his, which he said had indisputably fascist intentions. So we decided I just wanted to read from Wells's Open Conspiracy. Called The Character of the Open Conspiracy, the Movement Toward a World Collective, will now be plainly displayed. It will have become a great world movement as widespread and evident as socialism or communism. It will largely have taken the place of these movements. It will be more. It will be a world religion. So notice, it's not socialism or communism. It's something different. And this is, of course, where a lot of the bafflement has come in, and particularly in the United States, particularly around the person of Lyndon LaRouche and the insistence of Lyndon LaRouche on the issue of the British imperial system, which is often mistaken. There's only one real great enemy of the United States or China or Russia, and that is the British Empire of the mind, as Churchill referred to it after the Second World War. That empire has courtiers and jesters just like any other empire, but they are people like Isaac Newton, John Locke, and Bertrand Russell. If you look up Bertrand Russell, as many of us know, this is just something from one location on the internet, quote, Bertrand Russell was one of the most important scholars in the foundation and development of modern epistemology and logic, especially mathematical logic in the 20th century, end quote. Well, we actually disagree with that. He is important, but for all the wrong reasons. And to discuss why and what this whole idea of the British Empire of the mind is in the context of this issue of strategy, we've asked Jason Ross, who's the director of the LaRouche organization, to join us today. Jason worked together with a group known as the Basement Team, together with Lyndon LaRouche for over a decade on matters of science, epistemology, and physical economy. Jason, welcome, and you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. So the British Empire of the mind is, in a certain way, far more dangerous than you might say, the physical aspects of that empire. The military threat posed by NATO, by the UK-US special relationship, this is very powerful. The financial power centered in the city of London, with its offshoot in Wall Street and other places around the world, this seems to also embody a great deal of power. But the greatest power of the British Empire, the way that that small island has been able to run so much of the world, has been through the empire of the mind. And this is the kind of slavery imposed without shackles, the self-imposed slavery, where people hold to ideas that they believe serve them well, but have actually been engineered to hold them back, to prevent development and to destroy the human species' potential population, as in the specific case of the green policies from the British Empire. But starting from what the human species is, we are unique among all known life in our ability to go beyond our senses, to create ideas or hypotheses that may use our senses for verification, certainly, but the creation of a hypothesis does not arrive from the senses. It's an idea of a cause, a thought, a concept, an idea formed in the mind to understand how the universe operates, creating what we see as shadows. What in the complex domain that Dennis had referenced are the shadows in the real domain, perceptible to our senses. Meanwhile, there's an entire complex domain of causes, of hypotheses that we are able to access in a way that no animal can. Animals use their senses. They figure out things about their environment. They have senses of shape and memories and can remember people and locations and find their way through mazes. The technologies, you might even say, created by animals are of a physical kind. You know, we've seen pictures of various kinds of videos of various kinds of apes, putting a stick in the termite mound to, get their snack of termites. We've seen, maybe you've seen videos of otters, cracking shellfish on their chests with a rock. There are birds that use sticks as little tools to, obviously they build nests with them, but even for getting food, birds can learn a thing or two about this. So do animals have technologies? Beavers build dams. So do animals have technologies? Sort of. But the nature of all of their technologies is physical. What are their tools? Their tools are physical. Our tools are not physical. I mean, some of them, of course, are physical, but our tools include principles. So you don't see a gravity. You don't see an electromagnetism, although birds do see magnetism, or something like seeing it. They're able to sense it directly. But we're able to create as tools, not objects, but principles. So look at the use of fire, for example. Lyndon LaRouche has said, if we look archaeologically speaking at the real birth of the human species, you see it not in a certain formation of fossils or, the size of a skull or, which way the hips are pointed or being able to walk upright. The real existence of the human species came in our ability to use fire. Animals don't. They might enjoy a fire if they're sitting next to it, staying warm. They don't create them. They don't use them. Most of them are terrified of it. So we use principles as our tools, and in doing that, we transform our relationship to nature. Our relationship to nature is not fixed the way it is for any other animal. For us, we write that future. We determine that relationship. And oligarchy, the British Empire, the British financial empire, historically, oligarchy in whatever form, that of Zeus, that of the Roman Empire, that of the Venetian Empire, it absolutely hates this ability of the human species, because not only in that development do you overcome poverty, do you generate wealth, do you develop more of an independence from a ruling oligarchy, but you also uncover and experience more and more directly what that power is in your mind that distinguishes you from the animals, and that will ensure that you will not tolerate being treated as an animal or tolerate other human beings, creative geniuses and potential, from being treated like animals, like cattle, like beasts. So Bertrand Russell is called by Lyndon LaRouche the most evil man of the 20th century. Why? How did he do that? Much of the impact of Bertrand Russell is probably unknown to you, even though he's had a big impact on your life. And I know that Anastasia went through some of this on Thursday and may be on hand to say some more later today. But Bertrand Russell, 1872 to 1970, known as supposedly a peacenik, supposedly a socialist, supposedly someone who wanted to eliminate the threat of war from the planet, which indeed he said that he was in favor of, but only once the Soviet Union developed nuclear weapons. Before that, when the United States was the only bearer of nuclear armaments, he had actually supported a preemptive nuclear war against the Soviet Union to create a one-world government. In 1959, he was interviewed by BBC about his advocacy of a preventive nuclear war. He was asked, "Is it true or untrue that in recent years you, Bertrand Russell, advocated that a preventive war might be made against communism, against Soviet Russia?" He responded, "It's entirely true, and I don't repent of it now. It was not inconsistent with what I think now. There was a time, just after the last war, when the Americans had a monopoly of nuclear weapons and offered to internationalize nuclear weapons by the Baruch proposal, and I thought this an extremely generous proposal on their part, one which it would be very desirable that the world should accept. Not that I advocated nuclear war, but I did think that great pressure should be put upon Russia to accept the Baruch proposal, and I did think that if they continued to refuse it, it might be necessary actually to go to war. At that time, nuclear weapons existed only on one side, and therefore the odds were the Russians would have given way. I thought they would." The interviewer asked, "Suppose they hadn't given way?" Russell, "I thought and hoped that the Russians would give way, but of course, you can't threaten unless you're prepared to have your bluff called." So here's a man unrepentantly, over a decade later, saying that it was the right outlook to have at the close of World War II to create a single world government with a monopoly on the use of force and to threaten the Soviet Union with nuclear extinction if it didn't go along with it. That's a wicked outlook, obviously. But this is only part of his entire outlook. I'll give a few more quotes to give a sense of his social or political outlook. And then really, I want to look at how his view of science has done so much damage to our ability to make discoveries and breakthroughs today. So in 1923, so after World War I, before World War II, Bertrand Russell wrote his Prospects of Industrial Civilization, where he talked about the threat that population growth posed to his idea of a socialist utopia. Russell, "Socialism, especially international socialism, is only possible as a stable system if the population is stationary or nearly so. A slow increase might be coped with by improvements in agricultural methods, but a rapid increase in population must reduce the whole population to penury, to poverty. The white population of the world will soon cease to increase," he worried. The Asiatic races will be longer, and the Negroes still longer before their birth rate falls sufficiently to make their numbers stable without help of war and pestilence. Until that happens, the benefits aimed at by socialism can be only partially realized, and the less prolific races will have to defend themselves against the more prolific by methods which are disgusting, even if they are necessary. I don't think that even needs comment. So this is the charming Bertrand Russell. So his view of a single world government that would have weapons inspectors that could go and ensure that no other nations were developing nuclear weapons, that would be in a position of attempting to halt technological progress all around the world out of a fear of losing that advantage in weaponry. What kind of world would that create? It would create one where technological advance is itself a threat to a ruling oligarchy. And in order to prevent that threat, technology, development, growth, the human population would have to be actively suppressed. In those terms, it sounds sinister, evil. But when expressed in green language, those same ideas may seem to some people to be progressive, liberal, future-oriented, earth-friendly. The Green New Deal is exactly a continuation and implementation of what Bertrand Russell had dreamed of, had demanded. The Green New Deal is an imposition of a zero or negative technological growth regime on the world under the guidance and control of a supranational oligarchy. In this case, implemented largely not only through national governments, but through international financial organizations that will put out criteria for investment. Say, well, this isn't a green investment, it isn't allowed. This isn't green development, it isn't allowed. The countries of the world, they say, simply cannot build more coal plants. So a country desperate in energy poverty with a low lifespan, too bad. You're going to have to develop using renewable, intermittent, low energy density power sources. It should actually be extremely obvious that this is simply the newest form of colonialism. That's what the Green New Deal is, internationally. Now, unlike in the immediate post-war World War II period, where there was a need to maintain some level of technological superiority to keep up with the Soviet Union, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the view was that with that threat gone, with a unipolar world established, that same anti-technology, anti-growth outlook that had prevented the growth of the third world in a disgusting way could now as well be turned more directly against the supposedly developed world, against the nations of the transatlantic. And that's where we find ourselves today. So what I'd like to speak about now is how Russell's outlook goes along with artificial intelligence, which is certainly artificial, it's not intelligence, has shaped our view both of what computers can do in this kind of mystical way, but also damaged our view of what human beings can do. And how Russell's work in mathematics and science and in philosophy have dramatically hindered the hypothesis generating potential of our species. So let's get into that. In 1895, Bertrand Russell was working on a mathematics fellowship at, let me see, where was this? This was in Trinity College, Cambridge. He wrote an essay on the foundations of geometry. In 1895, and I'll be brief, in 1895, Russell said that the idea of curved space, that space is not flat and has a different curvature in different places, was absolutely impossible, entirely out of the question. He said that the idea that space may have a different characteristic in the very small than it seems to take on at the macro scale was absolutely impossible and implied a contradiction. This was only 10 years before Albert Einstein, in 1905, had his miracle year and published his work on special relativity. So Bertrand Russell, in his supposed work as a mathematician, directly attacked the tradition of scientific hypothesizing that Lyndon LaRouche has identified as the real train of discoveries that have advanced human economy and human understanding. Specifically, in this case of Russell, attacking the work of Bernard Riemann. I don't want to say much more about him here, except by way of reference, that Riemann, in his 1854 habilitation dissertation, laid out how the general concept of curvature, which was applied to surfaces, could also be applied to space itself. That is, space itself isn't necessarily flat. That the idea that two parallel lines would go on forever without ever meeting, that makes an assumption about the space in which you are extending these lines. This isn't about your imagination of what geometry is. Make it a physical question. What truly happens if you go, billions of light years? What will happen to those lines? Would they end up crossing as two lines pointing north on the Earth would on reaching the North Pole? So Riemann had said that the entire Euclidean outlook was wrong, in that it made assumptions about the world that we live in without making them based on something physical. More on Euclid in a bit. What I'm going to do is contrast what Bertrand Russell did with actual geniuses like Albert Einstein and Max Planck. So as a timeline, 1895, Bertrand Russell has basically said that the next decade's greatest discoveries, the quantum by Max Planck and relativity by Albert Einstein, Russell said in 1895 that those were both impossible, that no such discovery ever could occur. Of course it did. In 1903, Russell had written his Principles of Mathematics, having the same title as Isaac Newton's big work, where Russell attempted to transform mathematics, and by implication all of science, into a branch of logic. Logic explicitly cuts itself off from reality in taking as its subject nothing about the external world, nothing about, principles, magnetism, agriculture, none of that. It takes as its topic the way that sentences are formed and you arrive at logical conclusions from them. Russell said that that was actually all that science was. Science was nothing but logic, and he tried to prove that. That's what he was doing, 1903. Meanwhile, in 1900, Max Planck discovered the quantum, that in the very small, the universe is not smooth, that there is not continuity, but that there is something of the discrete in the very small, that energy comes in pieces, not of any quantity imaginable, but in very discrete chunks. In 1905, Albert Einstein showed that absolute space does not exist, that absolute time does not exist, that two events in the universe maybe could not be said either to have been at the same time or which one was before the other, that it could depend on the motion of an observer who is considering these events. Simultaneity, as a concept itself, vanished. The distinction between matter and energy was broken, expressed in Einstein's, the most famous formula of all time, I think, E equals mc squared, relating energy and mass. This is what Einstein did in 1905. Bertrand Russell thought that the greatest discovery of mankind so far had been symbolic logic, compared to Planck and Einstein, who were actually advancing physics and our ability to do things in the world. In 1910 to 1913, Russell worked on a book, Principia Mathematica, now with the same Latin title as Newton's Principia. In it, he tried to show at great and exhaustive length that mathematics, and again, he's implying he's getting into physics by implication with this, is nothing but logic, something that a computer could do, something that really could be automated. 2 years afterwards, Albert Einstein develops general relativity. So the approach by Russell is seen today in efforts to create general artificial intelligence systems, the hope that eventually we'll be able to have an AI system that's able to perform the truly creative tasks of the human mind. This is something that's not actually possible. But the proof of the impossibility of making knowledge into a form of logic, this proof was done in 1931 by Kurt Gödel, who used Bertrand Russell's language to prove that Bertrand Russell and his goal was hopeless and foolish, that any logical system was unable to decide the truthfulness of true statements that could be made in it. In other words, you can't know with logic. There'll be things you're never going to discover logically, never be able to know or prove logically. And this has been the whole history of human science. None of the great breakthroughs have ever been logical. What Einstein came up with was illogical. The idea about how space and time worked, Einstein's conclusion was totally different. It wasn't an addition, it was a revolution. It overthrew and forced the reconceptualization of all of those axioms, all of that understanding of physics. When Mendeleev developed the understanding of the periodic system of the elements, he didn't add on to physics. He really overthrew it with an entirely new language, an entirely new idea of what an element is, a new idea of what existence means, or of what a physical element is. It doesn't have physical characteristics anymore. It has chemical susceptibilities to form compounds that have physical characteristics, but chemistry is not physical characteristics. There's something else there. These are revolutions. So the idea of the complex domain, the idea that, and this goes back to Plato, and I'll wrap up with a couple examples on this. Plato in his Republic used an analogy of a cave, of people living in a cave with it was kind of a strained analogy, but these people are somehow, tied up against a rock bench in a cave. Their heads are fixed. You can only look forward and you can see the wall of the cave. And it's a cave. It's not flat. It's rocky. Behind you is a fire. It's wood that's burning. So the flames are flickering. Between the fire and you, behind you, pass people holding objects, puppets, who knows what, casting shadows on the wall. The people are speaking. You stuck against the wall might believe that the shadows are speaking because the sound echoes. In other words, your entire sensorium is not observing what's going on behind you, which is people walking around, a fire, you're inside a cave, they're holding these objects. Your understanding of reality comes only through these shadows, these irregular shadows cast by an uneven fire. And that analogy is accurate to our ability to understand the world. Our senses don't show us reality. After all, our senses, they're not connected to the world out there. All of our senses are in our body, right? If you see something, what is occurring is an interaction with your eye and your nervous system. You heard something out there? Okay, we're able to understand things that way. But in terms of what your sensorium truly is, something happened in your ear. Your eardrum wiggled. Hairs inside your ear jiggled. This creates something in your nervous system. Our sensorium is not reality. And even when we extend that sensorium, say through telescopes, where we're able to look all out in the celestial sphere and look with great accuracy at, where is a planet? What does this star look like? Let's look more closely at the moon. When you're doing these things, you don't observe reality itself. You've essentially created something like a huge eyeball with very good vision. And whatever is causing the motion of these celestial bodies is projected onto that celestial sphere as if you were in that cave, and then projections are being made on the wall. To understand those shadows, to understand those projections on the wall of the cave, on the celestial sphere, requires that you go beyond the senses, that you go beyond finding relationships among the things that you see, of going beyond empiricism, to hypothesize causes, to say, why are things occurring the way that they are? And those hypothesized causes are not part of the sensorium. By their nature, they're not. Gravitation. This isn't something that you sense. the least time principle of how light bends as it goes from air into water or through different kinds of glasses or plastics, lenses. The way that operates, the fact that light takes the least time to get from a part of its path to another. This principle is nothing observable. It's very much a human idea. So the crushing of hypothesizing, as done explicitly by Isaac Newton, who opened up his Principia Mathematica by saying, I do not frame hypotheses. I don't make hypotheses. I'm not hypothesizing. Hypothesizing, that's a dirty word. I'm just telling you like it is. I'm just writing out mathematically how to explain what we see. I am not saying anything about why it works the way that it does. So Newton, considered to be the great discoverer of universal gravitation, if he was asked, well, how do objects pull on each other? I mean, what he described is a result, that things accelerate towards each other, objects do. In terms of what was causing that, what would make all of that happen, no answer to that, right? Not an idea. It really was a relationship. Even if it's called a force, it was an empirical type of claim about how do objects end up changing their motion as a result of this gravitation. So last thing is to maybe give some ideas on applying this principle in economy or in politics. So in economy, there's two really big errors. One of them is thinking that money explains the economy, or that there's such a thing as monetary economics, which is just that phrase itself is a contradiction, because money cannot understand the value of technology. If you make a fundamentally new scientific breakthrough, how can you value that in monetary terms? Money is a scalar, right? It relates to the present, prices and things like this. If you have unlocked a potential to completely transform our relationship to nature, our potential population density, that you've transformed the carrying capacity of human beings on the earth, how many dollars is that worth? It's an unanswerable question, because what you've just done is changed what a dollar could possibly do. The development of nuclear science unlocked an enormous potential of energy to us. Uranium, no longer just a yellow rock, now an amazing fuel. Transformations like that, you of course can't understand them with money or with systems analysis. They have a transcendental value. The other issue is in looking at the physical world and thinking that physical production is where value lies in an economy. It just isn't. Physical production is also part of a real shadow, of a projection, of a process that involves, of course, labor, the productive powers of labor, but most fundamentally improving the productive powers of labor through the development of new machine tools, through the development of new technologies, through the development of science, through the discovery of scientific principles. Economic value lies there. It's created by the mind. It is put into practice socially through the organization of the development of infrastructure, physical production, new physical production techniques. But the real goal of economy is fostering the development of a culture, a scientific and cultural outlook that is able to hypothesize new principles, to implement them socially, and to bring more and more and more people into that joyful opportunity to play a role in advancing human knowledge and in coming to understand how that knowledge was created. So that leads me to the last thing I want to end with here, which is coming back to Euclid. Euclid is known as that geometry guy. He wrote books about circles and squares and triangles and spheres and all of this. He was tied with the library. He essentially compiled what had been geometric discoveries from the era from Greece. And he pulled them together in a systematic way and presented these as having dependencies on each other, In other words, from this axiom, I'm able to prove this, and from this, I can prove this, and from this, I can prove this, which is, there's something to that. I don't want to completely denigrate that. But if you present the geometrical concepts, or any concepts of knowledge, as how they depend on fundamental axioms, and you make that your instructional approach, your educational approach, and by implication then your discovery approach, you are stealing from the students the most crucial part, which was how were those things discovered in the first place. Discovery and proving can be extremely different things. Now, Bertrand Russell said that there was nothing more delicious than his first encounter with Euclid, that this made such an impression on him, it was like falling in love for the first time, or maybe he said like making love for the first time. He was really into this approach. LaRouche was quite the opposite. To him, what was most crucial was not geometry and shapes existing on the basis of geometric concepts, but it was always physical reality, and it was the power of the mind. How are ideas created? And what Bernard Riemann did in blowing apart the Euclidean approach was not just the geometric axioms that Euclid had, but that entire approach to thinking through knowledge, implicitly education, discovery. Will principles be understood as the result of our hypothesizing, or are they going to be presented sort of as a generalization, as a basic understanding? I didn't say that well. What Russell did was to attack the idea and the existence of the human mind. He did that by trying to kill people, which reduces human beings. He did it by explicitly saying that there should be two systems of education, one for the ruling class, where creativity is encouraged, and then one for the peons, where thought is discouraged, and that people in this lower class who seem like they might become a genius can be given a choice of joining the upper class, or if they rebel and stick to their lower class roots, you'll have no choice but to execute them. This is really what Russell said. Against that, we have got the human potential of finally throwing off oligarchy and organizing ourselves through an understanding of that creative potential in every single human being, and that this is the basis for thinking through our relations with our fellow human beings, within our countries, between countries, and so on, and that this has to be the greatest goal of a dialogue among civilizations, to be able to advance to that next level of economic growth and well-being, where we can be thinking of economic output 10 times beyond what it is today per capita in the world. Not some small improvement, an order of magnitude leap through nuclear fusion, right? Through fundamental new science. And that's the scale that our ambitions have to be at in order to be human. And that means throwing away and making fun of, repudiating, and crushing the legacy of Bertrand Russell.
Thank you, Jason. I think that people should review what was done here just now. I don't want to say too much more about it because I'll take too much time. But this is one of the more important presentations we've ever had on the site. It's also one of the most compact and succinct, and deals exactly with this idea of science and strategy. Now, Jason and his accomplices, I should announce, will be starting a class on physical economy soon that will amplify some of the ideas you've heard here today. It's designed to recruit young people, in particular, to replicate, the process that Lyndon LaRouche initiated, which is intended to overthrow the hopelessly flawed pseudoscience that has prevented further progress in physics and other fields for well over a century, actually. And all of you should work with us to help to create that audience, particularly of people between the ages of 16 and 25, as well as a general audience, but to reverse the 5-decade decline in American education that everybody is very happy to complain about, but very few people know what to do about. We already have a few questions for Jason, and we'll get to them after we hear from Anastasia Battle. She's the mystery woman that has caused this issue of Bertrand Russell to be revisited this past week as a result of her suggestion that we should hold a celebration called Happy Bertrand Russell Goes to Hell Day, since Russell died on February 2nd, 1970. Anastasia is the editor of the Leonora magazine, about which she may be induced to speak under certain circumstances. She's fond of doing field experiments on intelligence and has designed and conducted certain of those experiments upon the presumed person of Bertrand Russell. So Anastasia, there you are. So please go right ahead.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's definitely been a lot of fun. I really appreciated what you went through, Jason. I want to just underline a number of things that you went through on just what was Bertrand Russell actually trying to do, because there's this irony there of here's a man who's calling for global governance, talking about mass depopulation, who wants to control the world with this global government to, use nuclear weapons and things like that. While at the same time, he's thought of amongst the educated circles as being a peace activist and loving humanity. So what happened there? What's going on? And I want to take a quote from him, actually, from Bertrand Russell himself on what he says. He says, this is from his book, 1951, The Impact of Science on Society. He says, physiology and psychology afford fields for scientific technique which still await development. Two great men, Pavlov and Freud, have laid the foundation. I do not accept the view that they are in any essential conflict, but what structure will be built on their foundations is still in doubt. I think the subject will be of most importance politically is mass psychology. Its importance has been enormously increased by the growth of modern methods of propaganda. Of these, the most influential is what is called education. Religion plays a part, though a diminishing one. The press, the cinema, and the radio play an increasing part. It may be hoped that in time, anybody will be able to persuade anybody of anything if he can catch the patient young and is provided by the state with money and equipment. The subject will make great strides when it is taken up by scientists under a scientific dictatorship. The social psychologists of the future will have a number of classes of school children on whom they will try different methods of producing an unshakable conviction that snow is black. Various results will soon be arrived at. First, that the influence of home is obstructive. Second, that not much can be done unless indoctrination begins before the age of 10. Third, that verses set of music and repeatedly intoned are very effective. Fourth, that the opinion that snow is white must be held to show a morbid taste for eccentricity. But I anticipate it is for future scientists to make these maxims precise and discover exactly how much it costs per head to make children believe that snow is black, and how much less it would cost to make them believe it is a dark gray. So, just thinking about what Jason went through, this man had an understanding of how the human mind worked and used it for an evil purpose to control you, to control how you think, control what you think, even some of the things that you say. And we had a lot of fun taking this doing this on a campus out at the University of Washington, where we had posters out, one that had Bertrand Russell that says, "I know what you think because I made you that way." We had other longer quotes like the one I just read you, posters of what he actually said, and then just a long list of probably like 20 things of all the evil things that he did. And we completely flipped out the philosophy department, who are coming up to us saying, "Oh, you can't say that, you're taking it out of context. That's not what he really meant." And then you start reading the whole quote from his book or something. We actually had printouts of this stuff, and it was even worse in context than what people were, trying to make excuses for or something. I mean, it was even worse. So we really ticked off these students in the philosophy department because they didn't want to let it go. And they even tried to steal our posters. They were getting knocked over. People were yelling at us. But what ended up happening is that students that were coming up during this, listening to what we were talking about, started asking questions, they started to get it. But what Bertrand Russell was attacking, and this is important to communicate, that the way that we give you the arsenal to defend your own mind from this kind of assault is through classical culture. That's why Mr. LaRouche really emphasized this, because this is how the human mind actually functions. Classical culture isn't just some like fancy, French decor, or having some nice framed pictures or something like that, or going to the opera in some big dress. But it's, how does the human mind work, and how do you provoke it to form a unique thought? And that's been seriously taken away at this point. And what our organization, what we're attempting to do with Leonora, we just put out this really wonderful issue on what is an aesthetical education to help people in combating this. We've come up with a lot of polemics around various nations, people throughout history who have attempted to do this, who have attempted to create this aesthetical education. And it's really going to be a fun challenge to all of you to take a look at this. We can actually put up the link where you can get a subscription to this. It's $5 a month. And we want people to not just view this as like a passive reading experience, but to be able to take it to go out and organize. Right? Imagine taking this onto a campus. You made a few fun posters to get under some people's skin. And then you can start having these discussions with people. You can start getting out these kinds of ideas. And then you'll get responses back that then we can use to continue to make better polemics as we keep going forward. So this is how real intelligence operates. And I'm sure Dennis can tell you all about, our Executive Intelligence Review magazine, the LaRouche Movement's magazine for political intelligence. And this Leonora magazine is our cultural aspect in that. So I wanted to just situate some of the discussion that we're going to be having today with that, and invite all of you to get involved with us in making this happen, including on social media. It is evil, but we can use this medium as a way to do polemics like I was describing here, to provoke more discussion and thoughtfulness. So I will leave it at that.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Anastasia. I want to thank you particularly for helping to refocus with the ideas. And if people have joined us in the last, let's say, half hour, the topic that we're discussing is the science of strategy. Durable survival lies in the complex domain. And the reason we took this up is because the world is on the verge of going into thermonuclear war. The United States is pushing it, yet people are being told that somehow this emanates from Russia, and Russia threatening Ukraine, except Ukraine is saying it's not being threatened. And the same United States, which has on record, killed over 1 million people in Iraq under a false pretext and not been tried it in the international courts or anything like that, and also claims, despite the fact that right now it's withholding the central country responsible for the withholding of $9.8 billion, or approximately that amount, from Afghanistan, with some 22 plus million people threatened with starvation, about 1 million young people known to be basically about to starve to death, is talking about human rights and the violation of human rights against someone, the Uyghurs they name, but they never say anyone in particular. They don't talk about the geography. They don't tell you about anyone in specific, because really this is just a term which is used. So it's sort of a nominalism. And so the point here was to create a circumstance where we could take these matters up. Now, I know we have a bit of a limited amount of time. I'm not sure how much time Jason can give us. We have questions, and so I'd like to begin that, and then we'll go as far as we can go. So let's just start with a question from Cade to you, Jason. He says this. He asked this. You've said that humanity is defined in its ability to go beyond sense reality, sense perception, but you critique Euclid's geometry for its not being based in the physical. What is this physical geometry such that it is neither directly based in sense reality nor in the total abstractions of Euclid?
So let's kind of, I'm going to sort of repeat back the question. I just add a little bit more to it, and also I think hopefully answer it, and Kate will let me know. So the complaint I made about Euclid was, well, there are two. One was that he made assumptions about space that he didn't know if they were true or not. So two of them, just to say two specific ones. One is the thing about the parallel lines. Euclid claims that if you have a line and you have a point not on the line, then you can make, in a plane. So you have to have a plane first, but if you have a line in it and then a point not on that line, you can make a parallel line. So you'll have two lines that are always the same distance apart and that never touch. He's made the assumption there that you have a plane, or that if you have two lines that seem like they're in the same plane, that the space that they would continue to move in would actually be a plane, as opposed to, say, a very large sphere. Now, does he know whether space itself curves or not? He doesn't know. He just made an assumption. He says that all triangles have angles that add up to 180 degrees. And if they're on a flat plane, that's true. If you draw triangles on the Earth, you have more than 180 degrees in them. You might say, well, that's because the Earth is curved. But again, if you draw a triangle in space, do you know, if you draw a huge one in space, how do you know if space is curved or not? So that was one of the issues with Euclid, is that he made those assumptions about space that were unjustified. The second was that he expressed things in terms of truth coming as a deductive process from axioms, as opposed to how the discoveries were actually created in the past. So in terms of going beyond that, Riemann says that you have to first identify that you're making those assumptions. And second, the only way to resolve those questions, the only way to know what the shape of space is not going to be from thinking about it and imagining how mathematics might be. It's going to be from looking at physics. In other words, understanding better what governs the relationships of things in space. Look at what's happening in a space to understand what it's like. What is the nature of the relationships between different processes that unfold within it? That's the way you understand something. So, like in an economic space, the value of even a physical object in the economy, a screw or a piece of wood or something like that, the value of that depends not on the object itself, but in the real terms, it depends on what you do with that. Are you going to use those building supplies to build a whorehouse? Or are you going to build those to help create a school or a clinic or a scientific laboratory? If you're doing plumbing, are you repairing the plumbing for a hedge fund that's making the world worse overall? Or are you repairing the plumbing or installing the plumbing at one of those other institutions, a school or something like this? And what's the school teaching, you would ask? So, none of there's no self-evident value in the shape of a space without understanding what governs the way processes evolve and unfold in it. There's no self-evident value of things in the economy without asking in what process it is playing a role. So the value of everybody and everything in the economy depends on what kind of future we are creating. If by succeeding in our political aims to end this threat of civilization destroying, world-ending thermonuclear war with Russia, with China, to scrap that, to embark on a cooperation with these other countries and India and others for development to completely eliminate poverty on this planet, we transform the value of everything that everybody is doing in this country and around the world. And I think that that is the kind of thinking that Euclid or Russell prevent by creating, sort of a very much certainly Descartes and Euclid in terms of having, objects with self-evident properties, and the nature of their interactions is seen in terms of the objects themselves, as opposed to, what's the nature of the space in which they're interacting. How do we change the curvature? How do we change the shape of the political, the social space that we're in right now? How can we organize to have that as our goal? And in doing that, we will change individual people. What is our goal in terms of reshaping the kinds of basic axioms, the domain of thought overall? So that's what I would say on that.
Okay, he has a follow-up, but I'm going to hold on his follow-up and go to someone else because you'll see why. Here's a question. This comes from Jose, and he's asking this. If I'm not wrong, Jason, you said that human beings create principles that we use as our tools to then advance our species. But is it not the case that principles pre-exist humanity rather than that they are created from our mind? In other words, wouldn't these principles exist with or without humanity?
Well, that's a fantastic question. I got two to come back at you with. One of them bears on the relationship between science and culture. Did Beethoven create the Ninth Symphony, or did he discover it? The second one I want to ask is, oops, I just lost it. Hold on, it's going to come back. Our principles aren't right. So they're always of a provisional character. I mean, what Einstein did with relativity, it really overthrew, it required everything that seemed like a principle before to be reconsidered. Everything we thought we knew about physics, everything I can think of that we know about physics, it all had to change to take into account that new framework that Einstein had created. So if you ask, were the principles discovered? Were they already there and we found them? Versus did we create them? I think if we were to say that, oh no, they are there and we discovered them, how is that if the things that we discovered weren't even true? You'd have to say, maybe we have never discovered a principle, since we always find a little bit more over time. Unless some of the things we found will never be overturned, but I wouldn't bank on that. So I think that it exists. I think there is a part of both of them, and it would be wrong to say one or the other. So it's sort of like if you're having a discussion, two people, sometimes you end up with an idea that comes out of that discussion, out of that dialogue, that, did it come from one person or the other? I mean, each person had their thoughts that they contribute to it. But that dialogue itself, as a form of thinking, ends up creating ideas that aren't going to happen from, people just kind of musing on their own. The dialogue is the principle there. And so I think that that's part of the scientific approach. The way you got to think about that is we're in a dialogue with the universe. And as we do that, we have things that we say, okay, least time of light, springs work this way, energy and matter are separate. There's a conservation of energy. So we have all these thoughts, and we have a dialogue then with the universe. And it says, it's always giving us some kind of hint that we're wrong if we ask it the right kind of question. And then that's the opportunity to advance that dialogue and come back with something a little bit better. Say, okay, well, universe, what about, now we've got, according to what Einstein said, there's actually an enormous amount of energy potential in the nucleus. In fact, we have an idea of how much that is. We've got some ideas about that. Let us know what you think about them. And you ask, you do experiments. We had the nuclear experiments. You get to learn a little bit more. You have a dialogue. The universe says, no, that's wrong. Or, okay, well, here's how that turns out. What do you think? How are you going to explain that? How do you make that out? So I think it has to be looked at that way. And the idea of, are the principles created or are they discovered? I think that they are both, but they're discovered in the sense that our activity makes the discoveries possible, and they're created by the fact that it's not only us that's playing a role in their creation, but in that dialogue process with the universe. And then I just also pose for more thought that issue of the difference between cultural discoveries or cultural truth and scientific advancement. I definitely don't know if anybody really thinks Beethoven discovered the Ninth Symphony. But is there something about music that he discovered? Is there something true about music or about communication? And that discovery is exemplified in the composition of his Ninth Symphony.
Yeah, I have another question, but I cannot avoid pointing out or asking or putting in this. You think about Bach's invention of the well-tempered system. What is that? And that's sort of an interesting thing maybe to come back to, because of his own knowledge of, or at least being aware of some of the work of Leibniz. At least that's one of these things that people sort of talk about. Another topic for another time. This is from Kathy, who has often asked questions. Finally, we're going to get to ask one of her questions. The way we describe human senses implies that the five senses somehow exist in themselves and without thought. And yet, humans, and in some ways even higher animals, can't, quote, sense anything without having a conception about the content or meaning of what is being sensed, and how the individual sensing something must respond to what is being sensed. If that were not the case, then it would not be possible to sense something. If that were not the case, then it would not be possible to sense something wrongly, as perhaps the people in the cave do. Or in another way, the individual response to a sense would have to be right, or the response would ultimately threaten the individual's existence. Left-handed people might be very, pun intended, sensitive to this. Can you address this, please? Okay. That's the question. Can you address this?
Okay. Yeah. So we have our senses. So, when we first got to start working with our senses, so, we're in the womb and, we have some senses. Vision isn't going to be doing a whole lot, but, sound already is. You can hear things and so on. When babies are born, it's very hard. It takes a while to be able to make sense, to actually figure out how to use these eyes, right? To figure out what is going on. There's like impressions, the nerves are getting hit with things, to try to transform that and to figure out what's actually going on out there. Yeah, the kid is making hypotheses, making thoughts. They play with kids. They're figuring out, I can make this thing move because this hand is under my control, and I can bump this thing, and I can change where it is, and that's so cool. I just did something. I changed that thing. Whoa! I knocked this thing on the floor. Woohoo! Right? So, yeah, when you look at the world, you always have your hypotheses about it, and that's why, as you said, if that wasn't true, you could never see anything wrongly, or you could never interpret anything wrongly. Or, this comes up with the problems in memory and senses, definitely the problems in memory. Something happens, you ask witnesses what occurred, you get 5 different stories from 5 different people. They all saw the thing happen, but, did they actually remember it? Are they filling in aspects that are plausible, that maybe they don't really remember, but their mind recreated it when thinking back about the past? So memory also comes into this, in addition to the senses themselves. But I'd say, how do we extend this to an extended sensorium? So, we have the off-the-shelf, our five senses, or maybe more. But we have, the definite five very clear ones that we know about. What about our extended sensorium? When you create some apparatus and you're in the chemistry lab and you're measuring the temperature of something. So you're using your eyes, but, to look at a thermometer. But really, you're using the thermometer as like an extended sensorium. We're saying, okay, how does this, this mercury or whatever's in your thermometer, how does this change its size based on its temperature? Figuring out how to use that's a discovery. But once you've got it, you've now got, okay, temperature is now something that we can, measure in a more specific way of whatever the thing is that we're looking at. And I think that raises really clearly the issue of interpretations, because unless you were really just trying to do nothing but measure temperatures themselves, or like measure exactly where is a planet seen in the sky itself, and there is a field to that, but usually you're trying to figure out what's going on. And then you're right, you're always making a hypothesis. You're trying to make sense of those sense impressions. So in terms of how that's done, there's a big difference, I think, between how we do that and how machine learning does that. So when we do that, we have a model of the world that goes beyond the things that we're sensing. We have an idea about, like trying to teach a car to drive, right? Teenagers, when people are, not necessarily teenagers, when people are first learning to drive, it only really takes a few dozen hours to be able to, drive a car somewhat safely, enough to get a license to drive one anyway. Whereas, these machine learning things for cars, they're doing millions of hours of real or simulated driving, and they still make mistakes, right? It's so much harder there. So that, I think, shows the difference in the approach between our creation of hypotheses of how the whole world works versus trying to drive a car looking at just based on where do I see things, as opposed to having an idea of how physics works, how people work, what's a pedestrian likely or unlikely to do when they're standing near that crosswalk, all of this kind of thing. So I'm talking too long, but I would look at the difference between the way we make hypotheses and the way machine learning works as a way of thinking about what happens if you try to understand the world just in terms of the senses, which is that's basically what happens with the machine learning approach.
Okay, this is a question from Mike. He asks, how does a mathematician with such a bad track record, Bertrand Russell, maintain such a hold over policy? Would it be fair to call him a modern-day Aristotle? That's a question.
So, yeah, how did Russell get such a big influence? He is not alone. Let's come back to that. But let's look at other people who have a big political influence today who you would say should have clearly been discredited and laughed off the face of the earth. Namely, all of the neocons who are part of George Bush's circles who have now been welcomed with open arms into the Democratic Party by virtue of their saying that Trump was bad. So, the architects of the Iraq War now being rehabilitated, right? Dick Cheney, Lynn Cheney, being rehabilitated. Bush himself even, being rehabilitated. People who you would think have no business ever making another political statement ever, and then they get airtime, they get play. So is it possible that this also occurred in the past? That people with certain viewpoints are deliberately promoted in order to inject those viewpoints into popular thought and to shape popular culture and conventional wisdom? Yeah. So, in other words, Russell's success was not the fruit of his vast learning, his remarkable wit, and his great insights. He also played a political role and was promoted for that reason. In terms of what he did, because I'll tell you, I'm not the biggest Russell expert in the world, but I don't find him that impressive, to be honest. The way he got his sort of big reputation was with this work, this Principles of Mathematics, and then this enormous Principia Mathematica that he wrote from 1910 to 1913. It's an enormous, absurd tome. It's extremely difficult to work on. It looks extremely erudite, very well educated. You know, after many, many pages into it, he says that he has now proved that 1 + 1 = 2. It's, you know, that's the sort of thing that gets used as a credential to say, I am a deep thinker. But then you look at all the stuff that he said, these quotes that we had read, how does someone like that, you know, still get regarded as a philosopher, or, you know, have his bust up in a philosophy department somewhere? Well, what else does the philosophy department do, to be honest? How great are they? But, you know, this stuff, these things don't only happen on their merits. People are promoted for political reasons. We see a lot of it today, and the same is the case for Russell. He represented a political current in Britain and was a spokesman for an oligarchical outlook, and part of his promotion was to promote that oligarchical outlook.
Okay, we have a comment and then a follow-up question, which is directed to Anastasia and you. So the comment is just Jose's commenting, I think that principles are created intentionally. If it were the case that there were an infinite set of monkeys writing on typewriters, would they incidentally write a Shakespeare play? Of course not. It would just be an infinite jumble of letters. Creation, although they could write certain commercials, I think. Creation requires a conscious effort to want to discover a principle through your creation. All right, that's his comment, okay? I had it in my own. All right, there's a follow-up. Here's what it is. A follow-up for Anastasia or anyone. This is from Cade. What's the fault in combating Bertrand Russell's snow is black thought experiment with an obstinate holding to the sense perception or sense reality that snow is white? Okay. I think that's a question about true opinion. So you go ahead, Anastasia. Why don't you start?
Well, I guess I'm trying to understand what you're trying to get at. It sounds like you're trying to ask, like, how would we do this as a thought experiment for? I'm sorry.
I think, well, Jason, you want to take? I think what he's saying is, if I just hold on to the right idea, which is snow is white, what's wrong with combating snow is black by just asserting the snow is white?
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Well, the thing that I would say on that is that, well, for one, I think this analogy that Jason used about the cave, you know, when you're trying to take somebody out of the cave, just telling them over and over again, look, you don't get it. Like, you're in a cave, man. Like, there's shadows going on. You know, people don't really want to hear it. So just telling them over and over again what the truth is isn't going to be the solution to working them out of it. You actually have to provoke them to gain access to their own thinking process, their ability to form a thought. And that's where this question of using irony, pointing out somebody's axioms, what their underlying assumptions are, and getting them to see that the way that they've been thinking has been wrong. Because otherwise, as you're trying to drag somebody out of that cave, they're going to be kicking and screaming. They'll probably bite you. I mean, literally, I've been on deployments where somebody was so upset at our posters, they actually ripped it off and started trying to eat it. Like, that's just an image to put in your mind, that sometimes when you get under people's skin under this stuff, it can be really emotional. So you just got to be prepared for those things. We get that kind of question a lot, you know, can I just tell somebody the truth? And yeah, you should always tell the truth. But there's also a way to tell the truth such that somebody can be provoked to discover it, if you hear the difference.
Okay.
Yeah, or how do you get somebody to discover something? Because you can say things that are true, and if you do a terrible job of it, it's like, I mean, like, you know, telling people, wake up! Like, is that ever effective? Like, screaming at people to wake up. It's like, wake up, you liberal! Or, wake up, you Nazi! Or, you know, that doesn't get you anywhere. How do you, you know, if Tony Fauci gets on TV and says one more time the vaccines are safe, Is that going to convince somebody that doesn't already believe that? No. Now, going through and making fun of Robert Malone, okay, that could be fun. Anastasia, you pointed out some of the funny things that, if the vaccines were meant to kill people, then why weren't they all being given to Africa right away? Ironies are the kind of things that wake people up. You can say something that's true, that's fine. But, the point is, you're talking to somebody. How do you have a true discussion where you do have to listen to people and then help make ironies on it, Because that's the thing. Like, let's say those monkeys, Jose, let's say you had your monkeys. You're the zookeeper. You're put in charge. You give them the typewriter. And let's say one of them writes a Shakespeare play. Is the monkey going to know it wrote a Shakespeare play? Is it going to act it out with the other monkeys? They wouldn't even know if they came up with it anyway. And I will say that they actually did try this. Somebody gave a bunch of monkeys a typewriter, and they basically hit one letter a bunch of times, pooped on it, and broke it. So this has been attempted.
All right. So I think we've sort of come to the ends of things today with that. And I want to thank Anastasia and Jason and also Bill Jones for being with us today. Actually, Jason, you want to say anything about the class series? You know any more about it, or even if you don't know exactly when it's going to begin?
Well, we're going to have coming up soon, real soon, I promise, a series of classes on LaRouche's economics. And this is going to be a great thing for if you are new to our movement, or people who are, or people who you want to be new to it and find out more about it. This will be a great place to say, hey, who's LaRouche? Well, how does this guy think? What's going on here? What are you guys all about? This will be a way of getting at that. So let me say something extremely briefly about the outline, which I will now pull up here. And so some of the things included are going to be, it's going to be a lot of polemics. So what is wrong with the green outlook? Why does the Green New Deal and all of this, it's not progress, it's meant to kill you. And we're going to go through Lyndon LaRouche's ideas of energy flux density and physical chemistry as a way of showing the anti-entropy that's characteristic of ourselves and of the universe. So that'll be fun. We're going to talk about the productive powers of labor and why they don't come from materialism or from artificial intelligence, and why they can't be expressed in monetary terms. So what was LaRouche's breakthrough about understanding the value of technology in a way that an accountant will never be able to understand? And what's wrong with how people think you create value today? Like, supposedly Silicon Valley has created all sorts of value, but the actual productivity of the requirements for life, watching a Netflix movie and having one suggested to you that will keep you entertained for a couple of hours tonight so you don't think about other things before you go to sleep, is that making the world more productive? So we'll be able to then go through more about the sensorium, which we had talked about here, and about how discoveries are made. We're going to get at something that came from Jose's question about the distinction, or maybe non-distinction, between scientific breakthroughs, cultural advances. What's the relationship? How are they the same? How are they different? Okay, I won't say more about that. We're going to talk about the historical importance of the United States and the role that it has to play today, about oligarchism versus humanism. We're going to make fun of Bitcoin and of viewing the world on a capitalism versus communism axis, where you're looking along this axis, and meanwhile, here's Alexander Hamilton over here, here's Benjamin Franklin, here's Lyndon LaRouche, not on the line. Not on the line. You can project these things onto this line, but you're going to be missing them big time. It would be like trying to understand shadows instead of, hey, what's going on here? What is missed in that viewpoint, capitalism, communism? And then a lot more about the LaRouche movement. Who are we? What have we been up to? What have we done in the past? Where are we going in the future? And what are we going to achieve together? So more will be hammered out tonight. So hopefully we'll have soon a starting date in the class webpage and schedule and all of that, but that's where it's at now.
Okay, and Anastasia, before you get going, let me just reflect on something for a minute. You realize Bertrand Russell was born in 1872. When he was 42 years old, World War I started. World War II started when he was 67. He was talking about bombing Russia with nuclear weapons in 1946, first at the age of 74, and then again defended it, as Jason pointed out, at the age of 87, 1959. He intervened in the Cuban Missile Crisis, didn't do Kennedy much good with that. And then Beatle Paul McCartney, about 4 years ago, talked about how Bertrand Russell had briefed the Beatles on why the Vietnam War was wrong, which was the first time they became political. As you probably know, there's like a 6-hour documentary about the Beatles, which is sort of everybody's watching right now. Now that's quite a record, apart from what we've already gone through about the cultural impact. So when you went out and did your human experiments, you already talked about some of the reactions. And as you are the editor of our magazine, Leonora, well, what you've already talked, what's your view of how this kind of a character should be sent up and sort of embalmed permanently?
Well, for one, I think that everybody should go out and have some fun on their campuses, even if you're not going to school. I mean, we should just have some fun going after these people. I mean, really, I mean, I wouldn't have thought that the philosophy department would try to stage a theft of our posters. I mean, obviously, we're getting under somebody's skin, but really pointing this out. You know, I mean, we've had a lot of fun, you know, taking these, I mean, just actually something that you had gone through, Jason, earlier, that it's directly Bertrand Russell's thinking that it's a continuation through the Green New Deal. That's what this is. And if we can get people to understand where their own thoughts come from, and then offer them this new culture that we can create, right? This aesthetical education, give people the solution, the desire to not only climb out of the cave, but to help others climb out of the cave. And this is a really fruitful time right now, because so much of what people thought of as being the, you know, the reigning ideology of thinking in the United States or abroad, it has failed. It's obviously failed. I mean, we got 23 million people starving in Afghanistan alone, right? Directly being pushed by people who are supposed to be the greatest humanitarians, you know, of the 21st century. Ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. I mean, we should just point out more of these kinds of ironies, really just put yourself into this classical culture so you can train yourself to hear how other people are thinking, to activate your own mind so you can help others pull themselves out of this situation. And I think in a very short amount of time, we can have a serious movement of especially young people who are thinking in this way and are self-activated to do this all over the world. So I would leave it with that. Join us in doing that.
Okay, so thank you very much, Jason Ross and Anastasia Battle, for what you did here today. We're going to conclude with a short clip from Lyndon LaRouche on the American conspiracy called the American Revolution. Now, many of you know that Lynn is always referred to as a conspiracy theorist. No, actually, he was a conspiracy practitioner, but that was because he was in the tradition of this country and how it was founded. And so we are going to leave this with you, because this is the sort of conspiracy you too should join and carry out.
But in the middle of the 18th century, civilization was in jeopardy. The issues which had been dealt with in part in 1653 in the defeat of the Spanish Habsburg still existed. And then one day, in 1766, the leader of a bunch of American conspirators named Benjamin Franklin, who already had an established scientific reputation throughout Europe, went to England, and on the advice of Priestley and others said there's no hope, that the American people cannot live under the same government with this bunch of degenerates that the British have become since the 1666 Restoration. That we must plot and conspire to make a new republic which repudiates everything that Britain stands for in law, in morality, in political and economic policy. So Franklin, with the support of his Commonwealth Party remnant friends in England, such as Joseph Priestley, and linking in due process with the Republicans of Scotland, as typified at one point in the process by John Paul Jones, and linking with the Republicans in Ireland, as typified at one point by Matthew Carey, he took himself to the continent of Europe, to France, to Germany, to Sweden, and so forth, and in that year organized a conspiracy, a transatlantic conspiracy, to create a model republic on these shores. Every force that was viable on the continent of Europe, from Petrograd in Russia, Linnaeus's circles in Sweden, the circles of Göttingen, the heirs of the Campanella in Italy, the political heirs, the heirs of Colbert in France, and the heirs of Gottfried Leibniz throughout Europe, rallied and said, we will create a new republic on American shores. And so that republic was created and formally established on July 4th, 1776. And with French technology, which at that time was the best in the world, with the aid of volunteers from Germany, from France, from Prussia, and elsewhere, and with the creation of a strategic alliance called the League of Armed Neutrality, which was created by the united international force of these republicans, we whipped the British. And we established on these shores, despite Thomas Jefferson, in 1789 we established on these shores a constitutional federal republic, of which Gilbert, Marquis de Lafayette, said this was a beacon of hope and temple of liberty for all mankind. We in the United States represent, as of July 4th, 1776, represent a commitment to a great purpose, a world purpose, to establish a republican world order, and in the course of that, to eradicate everything that Habsburg and Venetian and British stand for worldwide. That's our purpose. So that men and women may live to a moral purpose in a world which is fit for them and their children to live in.